The climate fight as we know it is over. The effort to prevent catastrophic climate change, that is no longer possible. Climate change is now a fact. It's with us now, and it's going to be in some form for centuries. We're always being told that it's not too late to prevent climate catastrophe. But that's kind of a privileged comment, because what is catastrophic depends entirely upon where you live. If you're one of the people who live in the poorest and most vulnerable places on the planet, where probably 100 million people are going to be affected in just the coming decades by rising sea levels. If you're one of those people, then the climate change that we are already seeing, have already witnessed, can be and often has been catastrophic. There's a strong link between climate change and the increase of instability and conflict and war and migration in places like the Middle East and North Africa, across the Sahel. It's pretty well established now that the war in Syria, which was already a tinderbox, it was that society was not particularly stable to begin with, but after 2 or 3 years of intense historic drought, drove people off of the farms, out of the rural areas and into the cities, and ethnic groups, and very poor people who were not used to living right on top of each other started coming into conflict. That was one of the decisive factors in leading to the civil war in Syria. Now, the civil war in Syria has been driving the worst refugee crisis into Europe, that Europe has seen since World War II. That has led to a destabilization of politics in Western Europe. It has also, one could argue, helped destabilize politics in the United States. And so to have Trump and Bannon and people like Pruitt and outright deniers now in power is strange. Most of us who've been following this a while really thought that those guys, that the outright deniers had lost, right? I mean, after all, ExxonMobil was now on record saying climate change is real, and and in fact, if we're going to do anything about it, we would support a carbon tax, right? And I actually think it kind of upsets the apple cart a little bit on the right, I think the Rex Tillersons of the world, would much rather have kept on with their kind of soft denial, we support the Paris Agreement, but we're still going to open up the Arctic for drilling. I mean, obviously those two things cannot coexist. You cannot possibly be serious about the Paris Agreement and continuing to drill. The former head of Exxon is now a moderating influence on Trump, who supposedly wants to keep the U.S. in Paris, right? Because they know that turning the clock all the way back to 1996 and outright climate change is a hoax just doesn't fly anymore. We're at about 1 degree Celsius above the pre-industrial average now, and I wouldn't call this safe, but we have to be really clear about what Paris really meant in terms of somehow addressing climate change. They acknowledged that it really ought to be 1.5 and then failed to do anything serious about even holding warming to 2 degrees. The Paris Agreement, right, was certainly historic because it ratified, in a way, that gap between the scientifically necessary and the, quote, politically possible. It's clear now that given the way climate intersects with with so many other social and economic and, political issues that have, in fact, helped lead, to the political crisis that we now have in this country, right? It's clear that, no, we can't afford only to focus on climate change, right? That those social and economic issues that are also at a crisis level, all of these things are intersecting, okay? And so I think we can see that if we don't address all of these things together, what happens, right? And do we actually want to head into the kind of future that we now know we are heading into? Or do we need now to fight every bit as hard for just democracy and human rights and social justice as we do to keep carbon in the ground? A lot of times I'll get feedback from people and they'll say, we have to hold on to hope, You can't be all doom and gloom. You have to tell people that it's not too late, that we still have to fight. And that's hard for me. I don't have hope. That kind of hope is cheap. That kind of hope is easy. That kind of hope is not what we need. What we need is resolve. To be serious about climate change at this point is to be radical, right? Because that's what's required. That's what the science is saying is required. We're talking about a mobilization at every level, a society-wide mobilization, an economy-wide mobilization. I mean, it's crystal clear now. There's rigorous research and analysis showing this, that what it would really require on the part of the United States and the other major industrialized nations is what has been called a kind of World War II scale mobilization. So in the book, and what we're fighting for now is each other, I wrote about a number of people who reached a point where they felt to take any sort of serious action on this would require really laying it on the line, really taking risk, putting their own bodies in the way. Other activists recently managed to shut down the flow of tar sands oil from Canada into the United States, simultaneously cranking the emergency shutoff valves on all 5 of the pipelines. In every case now faces serious jail time. It's because they're doing what radicals who have lit the fires under all of our successful social movements in the past. They're doing what radical movements have always done, which is to force the issue.